Talking about the comprehensive plan amendment review process, we're going to move now into the actual review of comprehensive plan amendments. Now, there's basically two types of comprehensive plan amendments. There are what's called future land use maps, or FLUM amendments, and there's text amendments. And just to tell you quickly, a text amendment is basically an amendment to the goals, objectives, and policies within a comprehensive plan, while future land use amendment is amending the future land use map or map series associated with a comprehensive plan. Under Section 163, 3177, 6A, if you want to be a bit more specific, Florida state law requires that all local governments have to adopt a future land use map or map series. The future land use map or map series contains the vision for future development within a jurisdiction. So when a future land use map amendment comes in, it changes that vision for a particular area within a jurisdiction. And that can have impact on transportation facilities. For example, if you're changing an area from agricultural use to commercial use, you're going to generate potentially more trips. So things like that have to be digested and understood for their impact to see how, if any, mitigation needs to be done in those types of contexts. Now, when a local government submits a future land use map amendment, they have to do several things before it can even cross the threshold being transmitted to state for state review. There's 3 minimum data analysis requirements. An analysis of the availability of facilities and services that includes transportation facilities, that includes water, that includes wastewater, basically all the availability of public facilities and services for development that might be needed by development. There also has to be an analysis of suitability. Suitability analysis looks at the character of undeveloped lands, soils, topography, natural resources, and historic resources of the area that is being impacted by the future land use map amendment. And third, the future land use map amendment must identify the minimum amount of land needed for the map amendment to occur, as determined by the local government. So submission examples you might see for a future land use map amendment may include proposed changes, as I talked about with text changes, proposed changes to goals, objectives, and policies. For example, say you're doing a future land use map amendment, but you must change the goals, objectives, and policies which control the called a future land use designation. I'm going to take a step back now. The future land use map shows what's called future land use designations or categories, and those are the land uses that are projected to guide development within a jurisdiction. So a text amendment, in terms of submission examples, could be revising that designation to add a new activity to it, to change the density of it, change the intensity of it. Submission examples may also include a description of a proposed new phase, basically describing the study area, describing the location as you see on this list as well. And another example is the transportation data analysis. Now, when a reviewer is looking at the transportation data analysis associated with a future land use map amendment, they're looking at several things. In terms of the future land use designation itself that's associated with the amendment, they're looking at the density and intensity, like floor area ratio and pervious surface ratio, as well as on this list, the number of dwelling units per acre. This is just, again, an idea of what kind of transportation impacts will be generated by increased traffic on roadways because of the change of future land use. The reviewer is also looking for internal consistency. They're making sure that the future land use map amendment is consistent with not only the comprehensive plan, but also state law. And in terms of transportation data analysis, you're making sure it's consistent with whatever identified transportation improvements are within the comprehensive plan. you're making sure that it would be consistent with level service, transportation concurrency. So there's several things you have to look at. There's several moving pieces within the transportation data analysis stuff to look at when you're dealing with the future land use map amendment. And in terms of transportation improvements, you have to look at the transportation element and capital improvements element, because those will list certain roadway projects that could or could not deal with the impacts that you're seeing within the comprehensive plan amendment. Speaking of level of service, as you see the title of this slide, statewide level service standards are now advisory. Review and enforcement of level service has changed since 2011. During the time concurrency was being revised in state law back then, Rules 9J5 and 9J11 Florida Administrative Code, which provide additional guidance and requirements regarding growth management, were repealed, and portions added to Chapter 163, Part 2 of the Florida statute. Now, during this time, a year later, another administrative rule was repealed, and that was Rule 14-94, Florida Administrative Code. Rule 14-94 contained a statewide minimum level of service standards for the state system, and also provided enforcement authority to FDOT in regards to level of service standards on the state. With the repeal of this rule, that enforcement authority goes away. Now, however, the impact of this repeal removes the Department of Level Service Authority in regards to the state system. There are still local governments that still use the level of service standards that are recommended by FDOT. So when we're saying advisory, what we're actually saying is that even though the enforcement authority for FDOT to enforce level of service standards on a statewide system is gone, they can still recommend that those standards be used. And those standards are found in FDOT procedure number 525-000-006E. And in essence, those standards are level service D for urbanized areas and level service D for everything outside of urban areas. And even though these are just advisory, there are still several local governments that still use these recommended level service standards. Now, it's important to note that these level service standards only impact roadways. There is no level service standard within that procedure that's identified for bicycle, pedestrian, and other modes. Is there a question in regards to this, or?
Janine, I'd like to clarify. I think the procedure that FDOT adopted has also been repealed, and we have a policy that replaced. I think our policy is still in place that adopts D and C. And I also wanted to make another note that local governments are still required under 163 to adopt level of service standards. What was repealed is the state mandated standards, so that locals can develop what standards they believe are adequate for their jurisdiction. The other point that I think is important to make, and that is under the intergovernmental coordination element requirements, locals are required to coordinate with the entity that maintains the facility when they're establishing the standards. So for state roads, that would be the state DOT, of course. So they're advisory. We would recommend those in reviews for state facilities, but there's flexibility for locals in working with the maintaining agency on developing those standards. I kind of see this as similar to if you were working with a private water utility in establishing the standard for water, public water. You would work with that utility in establishing that standard, and the same should apply in working with FDOT for establishing standards on the state highway system. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or points to be raised?
Yeah, this is Gary Socolow, and just letting people know that currently the Department of Transportation is going through a study on how to better initiate and implement complete streets on the state highway system. And the area of highway level of service has come up a few times in our discussions, and I believe that you will see possibly recommendations from this group that talk about expanding level of service standards to different modes, and sometimes making the highway level of service less important than other levels of service or other measures of effectiveness. We have not officially done that yet, but I just thought I'd let people know that this might be on the horizon, that we are definitely aware that our level of service standards only covers the highway mode, and that some people feel there is a need to broaden our perspective.
There is also a level of service guidebook, and Andrew may want to touch upon that, because it does attempt to begin to address bicycle, pedestrian, and transit somewhat. But again, as Gary said, there's a lot of work being done currently to move us toward complete streets, more performance measures. So you should see a lot of work in the next year or so in this area.
Thank you, Maria.